You're driving through northeastern France. The countryside is rolling. Green fields, old farmhouses with stone walls, little villages with church spires. The kind of scenery that has been on French postcards for 100 years. Then you see the sign. Yellow background, black text, a skull and crossbones in the corner. The sign says in French that you are entering a forbidden zone. No entry, no farming, no grazing, no camping, no collection of any objects, no digging. Violators will be prosecuted. You look beyond the sign. The land on the other side does not look any different. Same green grass, same trees, same gentle hills, but nothing has been planted there in over 100 years. Nothing will be planted there for another 700. The villages that used to be there have been removed from official maps. The land is, for legal and practical purposes, no longer part of France. We've always been told that the First World War ended in 1918. The armistice was signed. The soldiers went home. The treaties were negotiated. The history books closed the chapter. The land disagrees. In a region of France that locals call the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, World War I never actually ended. It became invisible. It became chemical. It seeped into the soil. And it is now expected to remain dangerous by the most conservative estimates for somewhere between 300 and 700 more years. This is the story of how a single war made an entire region of Europe permanently uninhabitable, why the cleanup may take longer than the war was fought by a factor of 100, and why the French government, more than a century after the guns fell silent, is still actively pulling tons of unexploded ordnance out of the ground every single year. Let's begin. You need to understand what happened in this part of France during the war, because the numbers are, by any modern standard, almost impossible to absorb. Between 1914 and 1918, the Western Front of World War I ran across northeastern France and southern Belgium. The fighting concentrated in a corridor of land that included the city of Verdun, the Somme River, the Aisne Valley, and dozens of smaller villages. The fighting in this corridor was not the kind of war you see in most movies. It was, for 4 years, an artillery war. Both sides fired shells at each other's positions day and night, often for months at a time, with little movement of the front line. The Battle of Verdun alone, which lasted 10 months in 1916, is estimated to have involved the firing of more than 60 million artillery shells across roughly 30 square kilometers of land. A shell was, on average, being fired into that small region every half second for nearly a year by both sides combined. This is basically like taking the entire annual rainfall of a large country and concentrating it into a single small valley, except instead of rain, it's high explosive and toxic gas. Not every shell exploded. The estimates vary, but a reasonable working number is that somewhere between 10 and 30% of all shells fired in the Western Front conflict failed to detonate on impact. They buried themselves in the soft, churned mud of the battlefield, and they stayed there. That mud, churned and reburied year after year, eventually settled. The shells did not. They are still down there, by the millions. When the war ended in 1918, the French government inspected the damage. The conclusion was bleak. Several large regions were so saturated with unexploded ordnance, so contaminated with chemical weapons, so physically destroyed by the years of shelling, that no normal human use of the land was going to be possible for the foreseeable future. The government drew lines around these regions on a map. They classified them by danger level. The most dangerous category was painted red, la zone rouge. If you want to keep getting these kinds of historical investigations, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We post a new deep dive every Wednesday at 4 p.m. The original Zone Rouge in 1919 covered roughly 200 square kilometers, about 463 square miles. Inside the zone were the ruins of around 99 villages. The state declared these villages officially destroyed. The residents who had not already fled were forcibly relocated. The land was nationalized. Farming, building, hunting, even walking off the marked paths were prohibited. Over the following decades, parts of the zone were slowly reclaimed. Some land was cleared. Some villages were partially rebuilt. The boundaries of the zone shrank. As of today, somewhere around 100 to 170 square kilometers of the original red zone remains under the most restrictive classification, with prohibited entry and prohibited land use. That is a region roughly the size of the city of Paris, where the French state has, in effect, given up. Here is why the cleanup is so slow. The first reason is the sheer volume of remaining ordnance. French specialist demining teams, called the Département du Déminage, recover an estimated 40 to 50 tons of unexploded shells from World War I battlefields every year. That number has not significantly decreased in the last 30 years. At the current rate, simple math suggests it will take at least 3 more centuries, and probably much longer, to clear the rest. The second reason is the chemical contamination. Many of the shells fired during the war contained chemical agents: mustard gas, phosgene, chlorine, arsenic-based compounds. When these shells degraded in the soil over a century, they leaked. The chemicals bonded with the soil. Soil samples from parts of the red zone show arsenic concentrations 1,000 times the normal background level. Plants that try to grow there die. Animals that try to feed there get sick. The third reason is the explosive risk. A century-old artillery shell does not get safer with time. It often gets less stable. Corrosion weakens the shell casing. Internal chemicals can crystallize into more sensitive compounds. The detonators, while degraded, can still be triggered by impact, friction, or in some cases simply being moved. The red zone is dotted every year with deaths and injuries. Farmers who tried to plow contaminated land. Hikers who picked up interesting metal objects. Construction workers who hit a shell with a backhoe while doing routine work outside the official boundaries. The Département du Déminage log case continuously. The official tally of post-war deaths from World War I ordnance in France is now well into the hundreds and still climbing. Now, the deeper point. We tend to think of wars as discrete events. They start. They are fought. They end. The history books move on. The red zone is a physical refutation of that idea. A war fought between 1914 and 1918, 4 years of human conflict, produced a contamination zone that will outlast the original conflict by, conservatively, a factor of 100. The grandchildren of the soldiers who fought there are now elderly. The great-great-grandchildren are growing up. The zone is still off limits. The shells are still being dug up. The arsenic is still in the soil. The chemicals laid down in 1916 are still poisoning groundwater in 2026. This is the long shadow of industrial warfare. It is also a quiet warning about the timescales of human conflict in the modern era. The First World War was the first major war fought primarily with industrial-scale artillery. Every major war since, the Second World War, Vietnam, the Iran-Iraq War, the various conflicts in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, has involved orders of magnitude more ordnance, more chemicals, more rounds fired into more land. There is now a red zone equivalent in dozens of places around the world. Cambodia is still removing American-laid landmines from the 1960s and 1970s. Laos has more than 80 million unexploded American cluster munitions in its soil. Vietnam has significant tracts of land still contaminated with chemical defoliants from the Agent Orange program. Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ukraine are creating new versions of the same problem in real time. These zones, like the French original, will outlast the politicians who created them by centuries. The French red zone is unusual only in that it is the first one. It is the prototype. It is the proof of concept that war can permanently remove an area of land from human use on a timescale measured not in lifetimes, but in geological time. The next time you read a news report about a ceasefire being signed somewhere in the world, think about the soil. The headlines tend to focus on the politics, the borders, the refugees, the rebuilding. The soil rarely makes it into the story, but the soil is where the war actually lives, long after the cameras have left. 100 years from now, the Zone Rouge will still be off limits. So will most of the new ones. The fighting ends, the land remembers, and the cleanup, when it happens, runs on a timeline that nobody alive when the war started will live to see finished. If this changed how you think about the long-term cost of war, share this video with someone who is interested in history or geopolitics. The maps we look at are still missing pieces, even now that no peace treaty was ever able to give back. Stay curious. We'll see you Wednesday.